So I'm going to do a little bit of spiel. Bear with me, you probably all know a bit about them. But starting with Helen. Helen was born in London and she moved to Badminster in 2001. And it was exploring local legends there that was the inspiration for her first novel, The Vanishing of Catherine Linden, which I think we have got.
Which is great, by the way.
Fantastic book. She also lived in Brussels and she now lives here with her husband, her children and her 2 cats. Her work, which includes The Vanishing of Catherine Linden, The Glass Demon, Wishing Dead, they've all been shortlisted for various things, which I won't list them all, but they include the Book Trust Teenage Award and the CILIP, C-I-L-I-P.
I'm not sure whether it's CILIP or KILIP.
KILIP, C-I-L-I-P, Carnegie Medal, which she was shortlisted from 2010, 11 and 12, which is quite impressive. And her latest is Silent Saturday, which came out in April this year. Just a little bit more info for those of you who haven't read the bios. At school, she used to get into trouble for writing stories under her desk in maths. She's previously worked as a postwoman and a mushroom picker. And she's also the only person ever to have held a burn supper with McPhee and haggis in the town of Badminster Rifles. So there you go. Susy was born and raised in Liverpool. She studied Russian and karate at St Andrews University, harbouring vague notions of becoming a spy. She lived in Berkshire before moving to Crete with her husband and 3 fabulous daughters over 20 years ago. Her first 2 books, Husbands and Lies and Runaway Wife, were published by Ebury Press, and her latest, Back to You, isn't quite launched yet, but it is available to download in the Kindle store in ebook form, so get on there. She has trained rocket scientists in the former Soviet Union, and she won her first writing competition at the age of 10, the prize for which was 8 tin of chocolate biscuits. She also has the enviable privilege of being my mother. So welcome, both of you. So we wanted to start off by chatting a little bit about your work, but I know Helen and Susy are fans of each other's work and they have prepared a few readings for us. Is that right?
Yes, we have.
And a little bit of a twist to the usual format of these things, they're going to read each other's, which is quite nice. So who would like to go first? What are you going to read?
I've got a passage to read from Helen's book, the first book she wrote, called The Vanishing of Catherine Linden. And I chose this because, apart from having one of the best opening lines I've read, there's just the funniest passage in it about a woman who spontaneously combusts. So I'm going to share that with you. The opening line, by the way, says, "My life might have been so different had I not been known as the girl whose grandmother exploded." And I just think that's great because it makes you want to read on straight away. But the passage I'm going to read is where the family have gathered for a festive meal and the heroine's mother is calling everybody to the table. So here we go. "The moment my mother announced that dinner would be imminently on the table, everyone rushed to the bathroom, Omar Crystal included. Managing without a last-minute cosmetic repair job was simply not an option with Omar Crystal, whose one overriding vice was vanity. None of us had ever seen Omar Crystal without makeup, or with her hair au naturel. The latter was always set and sprayed into a sort of glistening silver helmet. Today, the hairdo had wilted slightly because Omar Crystal had been into the kitchen several times to dispense advice about the making of glazed peaches to go with the roast. She therefore took an enormous can of hairspray, like some kind of torpedo, into the bathroom with her, as well as her bulging bag filled with expensive lipsticks and industrial-strength wrinkle removers. Omar Crystal looked good that day, as my father Wolfgang and his brother Thomas lugubriously agreed at the funeral. Always careful with her diet, she had retained an elegant figure right into her old age, with slim legs encased in sheer stockings and fashionable little black leather shoes with high insteps and pointy toes. She wore a skirt of some velvety black material, unsuitably tight and undeniably chic, and a shocking pink mohair sweater cinched at the waist with a thin black belt. To her bosom, which still had a jutting appearance reminiscent of a wartime pin-up, she had attached a large diamante brooch like a medal pinned to a uniform. I like to think that as she took her final look at herself in the big bathroom mirror, she was satisfied with what she saw. At any rate, she spent some time touching up her makeup, so that my mother was actually putting the plates on the table before Omar Crystal got to the hairspraying bit. "Omar Crystal," my mother called in a tentative voice, not liking to adopt too strident a tone towards her strong-minded mother-in-law. "Mama!" belled Uncle Thomas, who was less sensitive on such topics, and who was no doubt looking forward to gorging himself on the goose and labour burst. Omar Crystal patted her hair into place, and then sprayed it with the dedication of a car mechanic giving a BMW a paint job. She managed to frost her bosom and shoulders with the stuff too, until the pink mohair was glistening with tiny droplets, and there was a fog of hairspray hanging over her. Then she put the can back into her bag and marched straight to the table. The main lights were out, and my father was standing ready with the box of matches poised to light the Advent crown. Omar Crystal just shot him a look that said, "Who's in charge here?" and stretched out her hand for the matches. She slid the box open, extracted a match, and struck it with a flourish. The flame flared up in the gloom of the unlit room, a tiny golden beacon. For a moment, Omar Crystal held it aloft. Then the unthinkable happened. The match slipped out of her fingers and fell straight onto her pink mohair bosom. With a whoosh, like the sound of a gas furnace firing up, the hairspray with which Omar Crystal had doused herself ignited, obliterating her in a column of flames. For one ghastly and endless second there was silence, and then all hell broke loose. Tante Britta let out a full-blooded, horror-filled scream, pressing her hands to her face. There was a crash as my father floundered around in a tangle of chairs, trying to lay hands on something that would douse the flames. Uncle Thomas, struggling to take up his jacket to wrap around the blazing figures, was swearing mindlessly, his eyes round with horror. Both Michelle and Simon were howling with terror. I think I was in the same state myself. For days afterwards, my throat was hoarse with screaming. My mother, who had just come through from the kitchen with the roast goose in her ungloved hands, dropped the whole thing on the quarry tile floor, where it exploded on impact. Only Sebastian, in his high chair, remained unmoved by the whole thing, apparently under the impression that this was part of the normal Advent entertainment. The rest of us panicked. And then, at last, with a horrid finality, Omar Crystal pitched forward onto the dining table in an explosion of shattered wine glasses and broken crockery. My father and Uncle Thomas sprang finally into action. My father upended a jug of mineral water over Omar Crystal's smoking remains, and Uncle Thomas spread over the whole mess the jacket he had finally managed to remove. It was too late for Omar Crystal, however. She was mouse dead, as the Germans say. The shock had stopped her heart with the finesse of a sledgehammer smashing a carriage clock. Her still elegantly shod legs akimbo, she looked like a shop window mannequin, and not like Omar Crystal at all. In the silence that followed, Sebastian at last began to cry.
Thank you. It's just going to take me a moment to get used to this thing. I don't want to say too much to set the scene for this piece, because I think that would give a massive spoiler about what's going on. But this is from Susy's new book, Back to You. And it's so hot off the press that I actually have a printout from the Word document that it came from here. What's happening is that the heroine, Claudia, has been working in a charity shop in the evening, and so there's a reference later on, which otherwise would be a bit confusing, about some bodies in the window. Those are the mannequins that she's dressing. And her long-term partner, Marius, she's not seen him for 8 months. And This is what happened while she's working there and she's thinking about this. Though it was dark outside, the street glowed eerily in the light of the street lamps reflecting off the snow, which continued to swirl and eddy relentlessly from the sky. And then I saw something, a lone pedestrian standing under the overhang of the building opposite, with a rucksack slung across his shoulder, watching me through the window of the shop. I swear my heart stopped beating. I hadn't seen him in over 8 months, but there was something unmistakable about the set of the shoulders, the casual way he held his hands hooked by the thumbs into the pockets of his jacket, that not even the thick curtain of falling snow could hide. Marius, I spoke the word aloud. Then I jumped from the window, knocking over the mug of tea in my haste, and flung open the shop door. Marius! I shouted it this time, but the wind snatched up the word and flung it away almost before it was out of my mouth. He'd seen me all the same. Through the swirling snowstorm, I saw him lift a hand in greeting. I hurried out onto the pavement, brushing snow from my face, and was about to step into the road, to run across and fling myself onto his neck, when a horn blared and a white delivery van slithered to a halt at the curb outside Ahmed's sandwich shop. Cursing, I ran round the back of it. Marius! I shouted again, but there was nothing there. No shadowy figure, no rucksack, just the empty pavement and the driver of the van in the periphery of my vision, swinging himself down from the cab and mouthing off about me nearly getting myself killed, and the relentless snow spilling from the sky and obliterating the landscape all around me. For a moment the world tilted on its axis, and I swayed unsteadily, staring at the empty place where I'd seen him just seconds earlier. Then I became aware of the driver's contorted face, inches from my own, his mouth working agitatedly, his eyes wide. "You never even looked!" He was pallid with shock. "Practically under the wheel of the fucking van you were, just about getting a heart attack." It was like being roused from a dream. "Did you see him?" I turned back to stare across the road. "That man, standing on the pavement, he's not there now, but..." I trailed off, blinking away my bewilderment. "How am I supposed to stop in 6 inches of snow?" "There was a man," I said again, "with a rucksack, standing under the lamppost. Please." I caught his arm. "You must have seen him. He was right there." I looked helplessly across to the deserted pavement opposite. He flung off my hand impatiently. "Of course I didn't see him. There's nobody there to see, is there? Christ almighty, trust me to get stuck with a raving lunatic." He turned from me and flung open the rear door of the van. I could still hear him cursing under his breath as I picked my way across the road to where the snow lay fatly on the pavement, its pristine surface undisturbed by footprints. I placed my feet where I'd seen Marius standing and turned to face the shop. In the darkening afternoon, it was lit up like a stage production. Samantha's naked torso lying incongruously at the feet of the other 3 demurely clad girls like a dismembered murder victim at a tea party. Anyone working in the window would be clearly visible to someone passing by on the street. I raised my hand the way I'd seen Marius raise his, then lowered it hastily as the driver reappeared from Ahmed's shop. He shot me a dark look before clambering back inside the van and slithering off down the road, leaving me alone in the deserted street. I sighed into the darkness. He wasn't the only one who thought I'd lost the plot. They all did. Mum, Dad, Richard, Grace, even Pappy, though we didn't make as much fuss about it as the rest of them. And yet I knew what I'd seen. For a moment, Marius had been there, standing on that pavement, whatever the unspoiled snow might testify to the contrary, and he raised a hand and waved at me. So either I truly was crazy, as everyone thought, or he really had come back to me, even if he'd lost his nerve before I could get to him. I couldn't blame him if he had. 8 months was a hell of a time to keep a girl waiting. And if he'd tracked me down once, he'd do it again, surely. Otherwise, what would the point have been in turning up out of the blue like that? And when he did, it would only be a matter of time before we got back together again, and all the anguish of the past 8 months would be forgotten. And then the rest of the family would have to quit it with their suggestions that I get a chinchilla and take up voluntary work and move on with my life. They'd have to stop trying to convince me he was dead.
and how in your work, well, certainly Katerina is very entrenched in the life and Batman's rifle. I just wanted to ask you both how important place was in your novels, because it seems to play quite an important role, you know, not just in the background, but in the actual telling of the stories. So, yeah, I just want to ask you a little bit about that and what your thoughts were.
I'll let you have one each.
I think probably setting is more a big deal in your books than mine, because yours are so evocative of a place that's foreign to a lot of us. And because you've lived there, your knowledge of those places is really quite detailed.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I also think that although I always wanted to write books, that possibly I would never actually have done it if we hadn't moved to Germany and I hadn't been so inspired by the place we were living in. And people have sometimes, in fact, commented that Battlement's Rifle is, in my first book particularly, almost the hero of the story. So place is absolutely critical to it. The small town atmosphere, the type of people, the type of events that occur in a small place like that.
I also remember you telling me way back that it was much easier to tell people, because you'd moved abroad, that you were a writer. You didn't have to sort of make excuses and say, oh yeah, I started writing. But you just went around and said, yeah, I'm a writer.
But I think that's true, because for me, certainly moving abroad was very liberating, because I felt that people would laugh if I said that. You know, they have no history with me, so if I said I was a writer, then they just believed me.
They just accepted.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think for me, place is important because I like to kind of explore it and get to know it when I'm writing the book. So, for instance, Husbands and Lies is set in Berkshire, where you were born, and so that was an area I knew very well, but The Runaway Wife is set in Harrogate, which isn't somewhere I know very well. And that requires a lot more research and a lot more attention to detail.
Of course, you tell me how long you'd actually spent in Harrogate before you started writing the book.
I visited it. But I also picked Harrogate because it would be a nice place to get to know better. And I did a lot of research on the internet and on Google Earth, looking at the road I decided that the heroine lived on. And of course, The Runaway Wife is the story of a grieving mother whose 9-year-old's been killed in a hit-and-run accident. It's very funny, by the way. Well, it doesn't sound like it ought to be. And I had the child buried in a graveyard that I found online that sounded like the sort of thing I had in mind. And when I eventually went to visit Harrogate and visited the graveyard that I'd chosen, it was at a time when I think a young boy had been killed by a falling gravestone. This is real, by the way, it's not in the book. And all the local authorities had insisted that people running these places lay down the tombstones flat, that weren't being maintained anymore, in case another one fell over. And I got to this graveyard, and in my head it had been a leafy suburban churchyard with a church next door to it, and quite beautiful. And the reality was, it was awful. It was just so atmospheric of something going wrong, and it wouldn't have been the kind of place any grieving mother would have chosen to put her child. So I had to shift the location, and I think that's a hazard when you don't know a place really well. You have to go and check it out and make sure that you've got the details right. I think that's really important.
And what's the impact when you do live somewhere and you set a story there? Obviously, it's a fictional tale. How much of an impact do you think that has on your work, but also on the people around you in the community? We're all members of this community. I think it would be quite interesting to know, if there's any stories to be told on that front.
No. But now you would speak to us afterwards. I don't know, I think you have to respect the place that you live in and respect the people that you know. And certainly I would never take somebody I knew and write them into my books. I would take traits, character traits and incidents and funny things that I hear and stuff that's happened in life. I mean, there's an anecdote in The Runaway Wife where she's talking about their early life together, and she's in bed feeding the baby, and her husband's coming up to bed and she asks him to bring the laundry in. And he's really grumpy with it, he's a doctor and he's been working all day. And when he eventually comes upstairs, she says, "Did you bring the laundry in?" And he says, yes, it's in. And when she gets up the next morning and he's gone off to the hospital, she goes downstairs and the entire rotary dryer is assembled in the living room. Now, that happened, didn't it, darling? So I'll take incidents like that and weave them in, but I would never do it in a way that would make anybody uncomfortable, I don't think. What would you say?
No, I totally agree with that. For me, this was a particularly delicate subject in a way because when we lived in Germany, it was a very small town, everybody knew everybody. And I've used the town completely realistically. The shops that are in the book, the schools, absolutely everything, the restaurants, all those things are really there, or were really there at the time that the book is set. And it did occur to me to think that perhaps people might look askance at me for having people in their town as serial killers and monsters and ghouls and stuff. But I actually asked some of my friends in the town what they thought about this. Do you think that people are going to be upset? And they said, well, actually, no, because you have to remember this is Germany, and the history of Germany in the last century was a fairly terrible one. And in fact, somebody had written a non-fiction book about the Jewish community in Bad-Münstereifel who were mostly deported. Only one person we know actually survived. And they were taken to a death camp and died there. And somebody had written a book about this subject and about really, I suppose, the shame of the town and this having happened. And that was a far, far more painful, sensitive thing. But even then, people hadn't been angry that the person had done that. And so they felt comparatively what I was writing, which is after all a fantasy, is not offensive. In terms of basing specific characters on people, I've only ever done that once, and it's probably the last time I'll ever do it. Pia Colvenbach, that's the heroine of The Vanishing of Katarina Linden, her mother, Kate Colvenbach, who's British, is based on me. And I thought this might be just fun to do, just for a bit of something to amuse myself. So she has the same hairstyle that I do. She has dark hair that's normally in a ponytail, and when she's anxious, she runs her fingers through the end of it. And she says all the annoying mummy things that I say to my kids, like, if you don't clear that up, it's going in the bin, and stuff like this. So I put her into, or put myself into that character. And when I started to show the manuscript to different agents, the first one that saw it said, "I love your book, but Pia's mother, what a bitch." So that's the last time I think I'm basing characters on myself.
That's quite interesting, moving on to my next question actually, which is to do with the sort of family relationships that come out in both your novels, especially with mothers. I think that's a theme that unites some of your writing. And I just wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about the family relationships that come out almost alongside the stories that are being told.
No. Do you mean our family relationships or the relationships in the stories?
Of the characters.
Right. Okay.
I don't really want to make any comments about my one of the things that surprised me, I suppose, is that when I wrote each of my books, I was thinking much more about the structure of the plot and about the mystery element of it, like what's behind the disappearances in the first book, and what is going on in Silent Saturday. There's a series of very odd, sinister things happening, but it's unclear what the pattern is. And those are the things that tend to occupy my mind when I'm writing a book. But I always try to portray the relationships that are going on behind these things, because, for example, the heroine of Silent Saturday does a lot of things which are quite risky. A lot of the book is about urban exploration. It's about going into places that you're not supposed to be and where you get in a lot of trouble or possibly in danger if you were
She does that all the time, by the way.
I have done a bit, actually. That's research. And the reason why the heroine does this is because her mother is very neurotically anxious about everything and tries to stifle her. She gets anxious if she misses the first bus back from school. She doesn't really want her daughter ever going out, and this stifling, oppressive atmosphere all the time of overprotectiveness is what makes her react. But when I put these things in, I suppose to me they're the background of the book, and then I'm often quite surprised when readers pick those things out as being one of the most important things. For example, the relationship between Pia and her parents in the first book, because one of them's German, one of them's British, and so she's torn between the two cultures. And that was so much part of our life in Bad Eiffel, being in an entirely German community but being British and kind of feeling sort of torn between the two, that it didn't occur to me that it was going to come across as such a significant thing to readers, but it evidently has, but it was almost unintentional.
You see, I find that really funny because you said that to me the other day, that you focus on the plot and what's happening, but readers don't come to the book for that. They come to see the relationships at work, and that's what pulls them in, because that's what life is about. It's about relationships and how we respond to other people and how we interact with people, and good relationships and bad relationships and relationships that are both of those things all at once. And to me, that's fundamental. That's what keeps me interested. Once I've attached to the protagonist, I want to know how she's feeling, what's going on with her, all the trials and tribulations that she's suffering. And the plot almost becomes the showcase by which you get to explore that person.
I suppose that perhaps for me, there is the aspect, because I'm specifically writing thrillers and there's always a mystery in it, I do have to think about the nuts and bolts of the plot quite a lot.
But you think about someone like Patricia Cornwell, her books are very specific. She was chopping up bodies, isn't she? That is the right person, yes. Patricia Cornwell. And it's not the story that's of interest, it's her story that's of interest. It's just a murder victim and it's just a body being dissected. It's what's going on with her that makes it interesting.
I suppose, though, it is a subjective thing, because I think at the extreme end of the plot-driven book, you've got something like Dan Brown's books, which for me, although I enjoy sometimes sort of reading the mysterious symbolic aspects of them, fall down a bit because I don't feel I know enough about Robert Langdon. The only thing I know is that he's got a Mickey Mouse watch, and I really hate that watch because I think it's so naff. And for me, I would enjoy the books much more if I knew a bit more about the way he felt about things. But they're hugely, hugely popular, so I guess not everybody does want to know the person's innermost soul. Sometimes the plot is what
maybe that's what keeps me hooked to writing it.
Yeah,
I've thought of that.
You both write about quite dark subjects. There are murders and suicides, although very lightly handled, I should hasten to add. I just wondered if you both quite morbid by nature.
Am I morbid? Well, I think there's a few people in this room who know me, and I don't think you'd say I was a morbid person in particular. But I do think that writers generally are constantly delving into very dark areas. And it is well known that writers typically suffer terrible depression and often top themselves. So I think you live with the kind of, that's sitting on your shoulder, don't you think, when you're writing? She's going to say no now.
I don't know, I've never been a tortured writer particularly, but in fact, if I am feeling kind of stressed about anything, I find writing a really great outlet. I mean, a good murder really kind of makes me feel great. If I've had a horrible day, then I can go and write a really horrible, grisly murder, and I just feel so much more cheerful. But for me, I think that it is true that a lot of writers do have a fascination with these kind of things, but to my mind, it's not being morbid, it's that everybody, all of us, whether we want to face it or not, is going to die one day. Some bad things are going to happen during our lives. Some things that we come across are very scary. The things we read on the news are scary. When we hear about somebody that's died of some nasty disease, it's scary. And also just those kind of ephemeral things like ghosts and kind of burnings in the night are scary. And there's two ways of dealing with that. Either you pretend it's not there and you never look at it, or if you're like me, you never take your eye off it. And I suppose it's almost a way of keeping it off. But I don't think it obsesses me in a morbid way, but it actually makes me feel better about those things, because in a book they're controllable. I've never finished a book yet where the serial killer gets away, having murdered right, left and centre. There's always some sort of closure. Everything always sort of floats up towards the light.
And I think as well, if you're going to write something and really delve into somebody's character, the character comes out at times of stress. You find out who that person really is and what they're really about. And if you put them in a situation that wasn't hardcore, that wasn't looking into the abyss, you would miss that. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree.
Do you think you have to be a bit of an outsider to write these characters and sort of observe from the outside what's going on in the inside?
I just think you need to be weird.
I was trying to be tactful.
I think I actually have been an outsider for a big part of my adult life because after the children were born, we moved to Spain for a while, and then we lived in Germany for 7 years. And although I think we integrated very, very well there, still, if you live as an expat, there are always days when something goes wrong, you get the wrong end of the stick with somebody, or you make a fool of yourself because you don't know how something's supposed to be done, and those are quite difficult days, and then you do feel like a bit of an alien. And then after Germany, where we kind of really settled in and finally got used to being there, then we moved to Flanders and had to start all over again. And we came back to Britain 2 years ago, and people are always saying, "Oh, it must be lovely to be back." And I'll be saying, "Well, I've never lived in Scotland before, so I'm not really back." And I love it here, but I've missed so much. One of the reasons why I've never set a book so far in Britain is because when we lived abroad, I had no idea how much a pint of milk cost here. I've never watched Strictly Come Dancing or Downton Abbey or Britain's Got Talent or any of those things, so I don't have any of that.
Do you know what this?
In fact, I'm purposely not watching them now because the people that do watch them seem to get sucked into. But yeah, so there has always been an element of actually being an outsider. So I guess that's why I write about them.
I wonder if we all feel like we're outsiders to some extent. Certainly at some point in our lives, we're all feeling like we're on the outside looking in. And that's just the way it is. I wonder if anybody here feels like they're at the hub. They're right where they want to be. We've all got our little demons, though.
Do you think then that writing gives you a free pass to walk around as another character, as somebody else, or as an insider?
That's a very interesting question.
Was that a bit difficult?
Hard. Writing, you have to get into the head of a character, you have to become that character, and you kind of have to, I don't know about Helen, I have to put myself in the position of a mother grieving for her 9-year-old daughter, or a woman who's just found her husband's details on a dating site, or a girl whose fiancé has fallen off a mountain. Because otherwise I can't write with conviction about how that would feel, and it can be really painful and quite traumatic sometimes. And I'm not even going to tell you, if I write a sex scene, I have to, tell you what happens there, if you're going to What would you say about that? I mean, not about sex, just about, getting inside the head of a character.
Yeah, I suppose I tend to think of writing as being a bit like method acting, that you do completely think yourself into it. And in fact, I've been massively enjoying working on the trilogy that I'm working on at the moment, because the heroine, Verla, who's 17 at the beginning and she'll be 19 by the end, just has such a really great life. I mean, she has all these adventures, she has 2 really hunky men after her, and she does all this urban exploration. It's great. When we first moved, and I didn't know anybody, and so it was actually quite lonely at the beginning. I just disappear into virtual Ghent in the morning, and I kind of look up at 2 o'clock feeling a bit hungry and realise that I just, in my head, I just spent the whole morning doing all this really exciting stuff in Flanders, and that was fabulous, really.
Yeah, a kind of sort of safety net almost for you.
Yes.
You've touched on a little bit on the theme in Silent Saturday, which I think is the first of a trilogy, the Forbidden Spaces trilogy.
Yes, Forbidden Spaces.
And I know you like to go off and explore these sort of strange and spooky areas. I just wondered if you want to talk a little bit more about that and about any of the weird habits that you have as writers that help you get into that character.
Shall I kick off?
Yeah, you go.
Yeah. books were set in Germany, and they were inspired by the place I was already in. But when we moved to Flanders, I was starting off from having to learn Flemish from nothing and not knowing anything about the place. So I deliberately went out looking for places that might generate ideas. And because I tend to write fairly dark, sort of thriller, mystery type books, I thought, well, I'll go to those type of places. So I took the train to Paris and went down the Paris catacombs, where the bodies of 6.5 million Parisians are stacked up in bony heaps. And I went down the Brussels sewers, and I went out... She's a classy girl. I am. I go to the lovely and smelly places. And I went out with some urban explorers and looked at a pottery factory that was going to be demolished, and that was very interesting because people had just walked out on the last day and everything was exactly as they left it except covered in dust. And because they started knocking the factory down, the whole of the front wall was gone, so it was like looking into a doll's house from the outside. And that sort of thing was really interesting. Since we've got to Scotland, although I'm still writing the books that are set in Flanders, I've started thinking, well, somewhere down the line I'm going to be wanting to set one here, so I've started doing a bit of exploration again. And I tend to just go wherever takes my fancy, and I've had a bit of a craze recently on old churches and churchyards. I've been doing a bit of research and pestering the librarian in McPhee once or twice for information. And one of the ones I did recently was St. Pessos, which is between Innerpeffray and Auchterarder. And if you've driven that way, you may well have seen it. And Lara told me there was an interesting graveyard there. So I went to have a look with my daughter. And we found the graveyard and apparently no church, which was a bit disappointing. There was a clump of trees, there was a mausoleum and a whole load of graves. So we looked at all the graves and I photographed some of them. And then I thought, well, I'll just go around the other side of this clump of trees and just see if there's any more graves, because I don't think it's really that interesting here, so I'm not going to come back, I'll just make sure I've seen everything. So I started round these trees, and I realised under the underhanging branches that I could actually see a bit of wall. And when I looked at this clump of trees, it was as though I could see the whole church just rise up out of the ground. The whole thing is absolutely covered in vegetation, to the extent that you couldn't actually see that there was anything there. So my daughter and I decided to go inside. So we went round to the other side where you could climb in over the wall. And we were standing in this ivy-covered, sort of spooky-looking church. And all of a sudden my daughter said, "Oh, what's that?" And I looked round and I actually screamed, because there were, under these overhanging branches there was this kind of black hole leading further into the church. And of course, having got that far, I thought, well, I'm going to blog about this, and if I don't go in there, nobody's ever going to forgive me. So I actually went in. I made her stay outside because I said, well, you're young, you've still got your life ahead of you. If the masonry drops on somebody, So I went inside. It was just amazing because there's the skeleton of the roof, but and a lot of broken tombstones, but there's trees growing up through the floor, and there's all this kind of dried out vegetation everywhere. And I could really say, like Spider-Man, my spider sense was tingling, and it was electric being in there. And really, for the whole of the rest of the day, I was kind of in a pleasurable state of kind of nervous excitement at having been in there. So, yeah, so I absolutely love doing stuff like that. It's really exciting and definitely a good way of getting inspiration.
And do you think that you just sort of like, I was enthralled, even just in that little bit of storytelling there. Do you guys think there's some sort of special, you have to be a special observer of the world around you, or do you think anybody can write stories, or you talked about blogging a little bit there as well?
You've just said two different things there. I think anybody can write. Of course we can, if you've got the mechanics and you know how to put words down. But not everybody can tell a story. And in fact, John and I were talking about this earlier, weren't we? And that's a very different discipline. And my father at the moment, who is 82, has just started writing his memoirs. Now, nobody would want to read them. He's writing them for purely personal reasons, but they aren't a story. They could be made into a story, and that might happen one day. And certainly, I run creative writing courses, and you can teach people where to get a story from, how to write that story, how to make it something that people will want to read. People don't necessarily know that intuitively, but you can learn it. And your success or otherwise will depend on other factors, and whether anybody wants to publish it or pay to read it, again, is a different thing. What do you think?
I think that anybody can improve their writing skills through, as you say, through technique and through practice. I think that some people are perhaps more entranced than others by the idea of making something into a story. I mean, my father is always accusing me of not letting the truth get in the way of a good story, because whenever I relate anything, I always like to I suppose, give it kind of a beginning and a middle and end and a structure and to tell a bit of a story. And some people like to do that more than others, I suppose. I mean, often a real life thing that happens doesn't really have much of a punchline, but so it's the way you tell it. And some people like to do that more than others.
Yeah. But at the end of the day, it's still a discipline, and it's still quite hard work. The trick is to make it not feel like it was hard work for whoever's come to read it, and that's quite a difficult thing to do, I think.
Do you have anything else that you'd like to read for us today, before we sort of open up and get some questions from
Yes,
the
I
audience?
think we're each going to, this time we're going to stick to our home territory. I'm going to read a piece from Silent Saturday. What are you going to read, Susie?
I'm going to read a piece from The Runaway Wife.
Shall I kick off?
Yeah.
Okay. So, just to set the scene here, the heroine, Vera, is 17 years old. And as I say, she's got a very overbearingly protective mother. And she's just had a particularly frustrating evening. She's been at the climbing wall and she's got thrown out because she has an argument with an English person, an English expat, that had a go at her for not having very good English, in spite of the fact this is Belgium where people are supposed to speak Flemish. So she's had a big row and she's been thrown out. And she's feeling very frustrated generally, and that perhaps leads her to be more reckless than she would normally be. And she's sitting on the bus on the way back to her village, and she goes regularly past an old castle, which is completely dilapidated and deserted, and she sees a light in it. And so completely on impulse, she decides to get off the bus and go and see what this light is. And this is what happens. So she's now approaching the castle. There was the light again, wispy and indistinct, dancing across one of the upstairs windows. Is it? When she was so close to the front wall of the castle that she could have put out a hand and touched the bricks, Verla stopped again and listened. She could hear the sighing of the wind and the occasional roar of a passing car, but she could not pick out any sound from inside. She began to move stealthily along the wall towards the front door. The door itself was lost in darkness, but the great canopy that overhung it was made of a pale stone that showed up as a lighter patch against the brickwork. She made for that, like a child daring itself to run up and slap the door of a deserted house. She thought she would check the door. Assuming it was closed, she had some vague idea that she might be able to climb the stone canopy to peer in at one of the upper windows. The space under the stone canopy was inky. Vera felt in her pocket for her mobile phone. She pressed the button, and by the light of the little screen, she was able to pick out the weathered wooden panels of the door, some scuffed and faded tiles at her feet, and a drift of dry brown leaves driven in by the wind. The light faded before she was able to take a close look at the door. She pressed the button again, holding the phone close to the wood. My God, it's open. She froze, her arm outstretched, holding the lit phone towards the door. It was only open a couple of centimetres. Still, there was something horribly suggestive about that narrow strip of black. The light faded and the open door was once more drowned in the darkness. Still, Verla kept her face turned towards it. Even though it was invisible, the thought of turning her back on it was somehow unpleasant. There was nothing welcoming about the interior of the castle. The front door was open, but there was no light or heat bleeding out of it, any more than the warm breath of life comes from a dead mouth. All the old castle exhaled was cold and the smell of dust and decay. Verla stood there silently, listening, waiting for the sound that would tell her that a live person was moving around in there. If there were nothing, if the castle, or at least this part of it, were empty of living people, she would step inside for a moment and use the light from the phone to look around. She leaned close to the door. Nothing. Not so much as the light scurry of a mouse crossing the neglected floor. She clasped her mobile phone tightly in one hand and felt for the edge of the door with the other. She pushed. It swung open more easily than she expected, though the long groan from the hinges sounded terrifyingly loud in the dark. Again she waited, listening for the sound of someone moving away, rapid footsteps in the upper reaches of the castle, or even a rat scuttling away from the unexpected noise. Still nothing. I dare you to step inside. The thought made her heart beat faster and her throat constrict, but still she knew she was going to do it. She would step in, and when she was right inside the castle, her back to the door, she would turn the phone on again and see whatever there was to be seen by its short-lived light. A glimpse would be enough, a secret to be carried away into the tedium of daily life like contraband. I'll have done something for once, something that most people would never dream of doing. She stepped through the doorway. It was no warmer in the castle than it had been outside. If anything, Verla thought it was a degree or two colder. There was a hard floor under her feet, tiles, she suspected. She was breathing heavily, unnerved by the sense of unseen but empty space around her. She switched on her phone. The little illuminated square of screen hung in the blackness. Its light was insufficient to show her the full dimensions of the room in which she stood. She kept pressing the on button with her thumb every time the light went out, and sweeping the phone from right to left, up and down, trying to make sense of the little glimpses of the interior that it gave her. Dusty tiles, sections of wooden panelling, a fragment of patterned wall covering. She was holding the phone up high at head height to examine the pattern when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of something dropping with a brittle clink onto a dark hard surface. Verla didn't have time to think. Her body reacted for her, jumping as though she'd come into contact with something scalding. The phone slipped from her fingers and hit the tiled floor, clattering away into the dark. The screen light went out. Oh shit, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit! Now she was fumbling for the door, her chest heaving with panic, and she knew that she ought to try to keep the noise down. She was panting like a racehorse, but she couldn't help it because there was somebody in here with her, in the dark. Then she heard a rasping sound and there was light. Not a great light, but the light she had seen from outside. Small, yellow, dancing and flickering. And in the light she saw it. High up, impossibly high up in the inky blackness, its hollows and lines, grave and deep like the wavering light. A face.
Whoa.
Now, just to put you in the picture, I'm reading from the start of The Runaway Wife. Marion, the heroine, has decided she's going to commit suicide that night, and she's gone out to try and get the drugs to do it. However, where am I reading this from? When she gets to the shop that she thought was a pharmacy, it's disappeared and there's an electrical store in its place. So I'm going to read to you what happens to her. Just one second. Are you sitting comfortably? Okay. I park just along from the bus depot and make my way across the road and then stop in bewilderment. The chemist shop has gone. In its place is a glossy Sony outlet with an array of televisions and hi-fi equipment displayed in the window. When did that happen? I could swear I was here just a couple of weeks ago picking up vitamin pills for Hope. Hope, by the way, is her daughter. But then time plays tricks on you when you've lost something precious, the plot, for instance, or a child. You find yourself marching to a tune that no one else can hear. I'm heading back to the car, muttering to myself, wondering whether I should postpone the whole thing until I can get the prescription made up, or whether I should just go for it with the 9 pills I have, when someone steps out in front of me. I don't see him at first. Then when I realise he's standing there, I just put my head down and pretend I haven't noticed him. I've become quite good at that lately, and frankly, most people are happy to be ignored. But as I try to pass him, he steps right into my path and mutters something I can't quite catch. I give an exasperated touch. What? I squint in the streetlight, trying to make out a face beneath the hood. He steps in closer, and I can feel the fetid warmth of his breath on my neck. Then suddenly he reaches over and seizes a handful of my hair in a not too clean fist, causing me to gasp in pain. but only at the point where I can feel the cold metal of something sharp against my neck does it dawn on me that this isn't a concerned friend or neighbour about to inquire about my emotional well-being. As my head struggles to make sense of what's happening, my heart sets off at a gallop and I realise with a gasp that I haven't forgotten all those other feelings after all. After the months of condolences and counselling and people tripping over themselves around me while the rage bubbled and simmered away inside, it takes the stench of the boy's casual viciousness and the hard, unyielding knife at my throat for me to realise, a tad late perhaps, that maybe I'm not quite so ready to die as I thought. Not like this, anyway, not on his terms. The boy presses harder on the knife. I said, give me your money. What? I'm repeating myself, probably not the best strategy for defusing the situation. Swear down, I'm not kidding. He leans his scrawny body against mine, pressing my back painfully against the wall behind me, and then abruptly releases my hair and starts fumbling around in my handbag, wrenching out my purse and causing the prescription I'm clutching in my hand to flutter to the ground. Hey! I'm more concerned with the loss of the prescription than anything else. He shoves the purse under my nose. Your money! Get it out! I regard him in astonishment, and then the irony of the situation hits me, and I can't help myself. I give a short, shocked laugh. Are you mugging me? He looks at me as I'm deranged. No, I'm asking for a fucking date, which, given the circumstances, I actually think is quite witty. Then, without releasing the pressure of the knife on my neck, he shakes open my purse and peers inside. The look of contempt he shoots me would curdle milk. Is that it? He upends the purse, a £1 5 note and an assortment of small change rained down upon the pavement. Yes, well, I feel absurdly defensive. I only came out for a couple of things. Fuck's sake! He spits disgustedly right at my feet and increases the pressure of the knife on my neck. Right then, he breathes, leaning in close once again. Someone really ought to tell him about his breath. Get your card out and we'll go to Cash Point together, and don't go trying out daft. What? I stare at him in consternation. No, I can't go to the Cash Point. I have plans for the evening. A sudden recollection of my lovely clean house waiting for me to come home and do myself in flashes into my head. I've changed the sheets and everything. What? His jaw drops and I capitalise on his hesitation to push him away from me and snatch back my purse from his hand. I said no. I fasten the purse irritatedly, noting with satisfaction a surge of anger beginning to build inside me. I am back on familiar territory. It's one thing to have taken the decision myself to end my life, quite another for some spotty kid with bad teeth and bitten nails to presume to threaten it. Who do you think you are? The boy's brow darkens, and suddenly I notice, not without a clue to belong, another feeling. My whole body is suddenly alive with them. Something I failed to spot earlier, a gleam of lust behind his eyes. I open my mouth to say something, but before I can speak, the boy, youth, steps in close once again and passes his tongue lasciviously across his lips, testing the tip of the knife against his forefinger with a cold smile. I'll tell you all I am, love. He runs the blade almost seductively down the side of my face, leaning in closely, and for one absurd moment I think he's going to kiss me. I almost brace myself to respond. Then he breathes his next sentence right into my mouth. I'm your worst fucking nightmare.
Well, we've got a few more minutes, so I wondered if anybody had any questions out there for our lovely authors. Yes?
Just ask whether you have your plots all set out in your head before you start writing, or whether it changes or you don't know what's going to happen, you just have an idea you want to run with.
That's a question I've been asked a lot, and I know I can't answer for all writers, and I think some people don't write like this at all, but I start off with the idea and the character, and then I'm as surprised as the next person as it starts to develop. So no, I don't have the plot in my head. I have a vague idea about what I want to put this person through, and then I create the person and they kind of take over, they tell the story for me.
I'm completely the other way around. I always like to have the skeleton of the plot completely out in my head. In fact, on one or two occasions when there's been details that I haven't really worked out beforehand because I was under a lot of time pressure to start the book, I've regretted it because I've kind of painted myself into a corner with something. But it's always the skeleton of the story. There's still developments that can occur. I think I heard another writer describe writing a book in a way which I think really sums it up, which is to say it's like going on a very long car journey at night. You know what your ultimate destination is, but you can only ever see as far as the headlights. And it is a bit like that because I'm always concentrating on the bit I'm on, but I do know where it's going in the end. You? I don't know, I think it's just maybe a bit of kind of control freakery or something I have to know.
And I think as well, I was a technical author for years, and there is such a strict way of producing a piece of documentation in the world of industry. You have to start with a skeleton, and then you get that improved, and then you flesh it out, and then somebody reads it and gives you comments back, and it's all very controlled, and that's perhaps why I don't write fiction like that. Maybe I've just had enough of other people and the control. Maybe I just like to, run with it and see what happens. And I do think if you create a strong character, they will tell the story for you. And they'll do things that you didn't even expect them to do, which is really weird.
Anybody else?
A question for Helen. Which crime writers have influenced you?
I have to honestly say that I don't really think any crime writers have consciously influenced me at all, but there are several other writers that have influenced me. And before I started writing full-length novels, I used to write ghost stories, and I'm a terrific fan of the ghost story writer M.R. James. And so I think that he's influenced me in the sense that I don't like to be too gross with the nastiness in books. I think sometimes what you don't say is as good as what you actually come out and say. There's a scene in the one that is being published next year, which is called Demons of Ghent, and it follows on from this book, in which somebody breaks into a Roman Catholic priest's house during the night and attacks him with a knife. But I tried very hard not to actually describe exactly what the person was doing. You can see that there's something glittering, swooping in the air between the two people, but I think that if you have to spell out exactly what's happening, it just turns into a sort of butcher's shop. And I don't like to do that. So from that point of view, I like that sort of old-fashioned, less is more sort of way of doing things. I try not to consciously echo anything that anybody else does, but my absolutely greatest literary hero, without doubt, is Victorian writer Anthony Trollope, because I just admire his ability to combine a massive work ethic with tremendous creativity. And his father was made bankrupt when he was quite young, and so he had to work for the post office as a young man, riding many miles every day, surveying areas where they were going to put new postal routes down in Ireland. And he still found time to get up early every morning and do his 1,000 words. And that I admire almost more than anything in his style, because it's so hard to do that, to have that discipline. But having said that, there's nothing of the way that he writes in what I do. I just admire his dedication to the craft.
Any more questions?
For both of you. What special talents do you feel you have to be able to create other characters which are convincing? Because they were really different people from you. You see life in a totally different way.
I think you have to have very good observational skills, and great recall and discipline to make notes about what you do see. I don't know whether they're special talents, they're things that everybody could certainly cultivate.
But you find yourself questioning people.
Yes.
That's quite difficult. Also.
Yes, and I sometimes think, especially when I first meet people, I must come across as really nosy. Because I want to know how they met, how long they've been together, what they like to do at the weekends, and I ferret out details about them. Yeah, I'm a great investigator.
I think as well there has to be a certain amount of kind of blithe confidence in it as well, because I must admit myself that I think fine when I wrote books set in Germany with German characters, I lived there for 7 years and we had a complete immersion in the German way of life. But when I started writing Flemish character, I sometimes did think to myself, are you completely nuts here? You're not married to a Flemish person. I mean, when I started writing that, I'd been living there, I suppose, a year and a half or something. This is really crazy to attempt this. So I think to a certain extent accident, you just have to have that ability to throw yourself into it and not worry too much about that, because otherwise you just never do it.
More questions? No?
Well, there's more wine, and nobody's leaving until every one of those oatcakes has been eaten.
There is one other thing as well, we've not got to let go. We want to say a particular thank you to the people that have sponsored this evening. The wine was sponsored by Harrison's, and the food by a combination of McPhee's and Susy, who's also doing a huge amount of graft. But we wanted to say a particular thank you to the Petries for the venue, which is, I'm sure you'll agree, is a really, really fantastic one. So we've got a very small present for them here. So, Katrina, do you want to come forward? And there you go. Do you want to give that to your mum? And can we have a round of applause, please?
And please have drinks, come and buy some more books. We're going now every 15 minutes, and we'd love to have a chat with you before you all leave. Thanks all very much for coming.
Thank you.